They found his hat 3 weeks after the signing. Just the hat, floating face down in the oily water beneath the Brooklyn Bridge, circling slowly in the current like a dark prayer that refused to sink. The fedora still held its shape. Beaver felt gone black with river scum. The silk band stained with something that might have been blood or might have been rust from the girders above. Nobody claimed it. Nobody asked questions. And in the neighborhood where Anthony Coletti had grown up, where his father still ran every speakeasy, every number, every breath of air that passed through frightened lungs, his name became a word you didn't say. Not in confession, not in sleep, not even when you were sure you were alone. This is the story of what happens when peace costs more than war, when a handshake becomes an execution, and when a father learns that the only thing more dangerous than breaking the rules is following them. Before we continue the story of the Don's son who vanished, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to follow this story to the end. Winter came early to Brooklyn in 1936. By November, the streets wore a glaze of ice that made the cobblestones treacherous, sent old women clutching door frames, turned every footstep into a negotiation with gravity. The cold settled into the brick and mortar of Red Hook like an old debt, something you felt in your bones before you felt it on your skin. In the back room of Coletti's social club on Union Street, where the radiator clanked and hissed but never quite drove out the damp, Salvatore Coletti sat at a table older than his 48 years and studied the faces of men he'd known since childhood. Some he'd loved, some he'd killed. Most occupied that peculiar space between the two, where loyalty and necessity blurred into something that kept you warm at night or put you in the ground before morning. The room smelled of cigars and coffee gone bitter in the pot, of wet wool and hair tonic, of sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. 8 men besides Salvatore, each one a captain in his own right, soldiers behind them in the street with their hands in their coat pockets and their eyes on the corners, where trouble always started. They'd been meeting like this for 6 weeks now, ever since the Gallo brothers had made their play for the waterfront, and 3 of Salvatore's best earners had turned up in a Buick on the bottom of Gowanus Canal with their throats opened like second mouths. Bad for business, worse for reputation. The kind of thing that made other families wonder if maybe your time was finished, if maybe the old rules didn't apply anymore, if maybe a man who couldn't protect his own wasn't worth the respect he demanded. Salvatore had wanted war, clean and simple, the way his father had taught him, the way it had always been done when somebody forgot their place. But Giancarlo Gallo was connected all the way to Chicago, had money coming in from the unions and the judges both, and when the commission sent word down from New York that this dispute would end at a table instead of in the street, Salvatore learned what every Don eventually learns, that power without permission is just another word for suicide. So he'd swallowed his pride along with his rage, put on his good suit, and agreed to talk. The terms were simple enough. A line down the middle of Red Hook. Coletti keeps the numbers and the loan sharking, Gallo takes the docks and the trucking. Nobody crosses, nobody bleeds, everyone eats. The commission brokers it, guarantees it, and any man who breaks the peace answers to them. Salvatore had signed the papers in a restaurant in Manhattan with white tablecloths and waiters who pretended not to understand English when you talked about things that mattered. Gallo had smiled across the table like they were old friends, like he hadn't ordered the deaths of 3 men whose children still asked when Papa was coming home, and when they shook hands for the photograph, for the proof that peace had been restored, Salvatore felt his son Anthony's eyes on him from across the room and knew without looking that the boy thought he'd gone soft. Anthony was 23 that winter, old enough to have killed his first man, but young enough to think it meant something. Tall like his mother's family, with the dark Sicilian features that made women nervous and other men careful. He'd been raised in the life the way some boys were raised in the church, learning the catechism of respect and omertà before he could properly spell either word. Salvatore had tried to keep him out of it at first, send him to college maybe, give him a chance at something clean. But the boy had his father's blood and his father's pride, and by the time he was 16 he was running messages, by 18 he was collecting debts, and by 20 he'd put a man in the hospital for calling the Coletti name into question. That man never walked right again. Never talked much either after they wired his jaw shut. Salvatore watched his son now, standing by the window with his back to the room, shoulders rigid beneath his overcoat. The boy hadn't said a word since they'd returned from Manhattan 3 days ago, hadn't met his father's eyes, just stood there smoking cigarette after cigarette, staring out at the street like he was waiting for something that never came. The other men felt it too, the tension that Anthony carried into every room lately, the anger that sat on him like a coat he couldn't take off. Paulie Moretti, who'd known the boy since he was in diapers, had pulled Salvatore aside that morning and said maybe Anthony needed some time away. Florida, maybe. Let him cool down, let him forget about the gallows for a while. But Salvatore knew his son, knew that sending him away now would be the same as calling him weak. And a man's reputation was all he had in this life. Lose that, and you might as well put the gun in your own mouth and save someone else the trouble. The meeting broke up just after midnight. The captains filed out one by one, each man stopping to kiss Salvatore's ring, to murmur their loyalty, to promise that the peace would hold. Salvatore nodded and accepted their words because that was his role, but inside he felt the same thing he'd felt since signing that paper in Manhattan, that something fundamental had shifted, that the old ways were dying, and nobody had bothered to ask the old men if they were ready to die with them. When the last captain was gone, when it was just Salvatore and Anthony in the room with the radiator still clanking its futile warmth, the father turned to his son and waited. Anthony crushed his cigarette into an ashtray already overflowing. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. The muscle there jumping like something alive beneath the skin. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that preceded violence. He said, "You should have let me kill him." Salvatore didn't ask who. There was only one him worth killing. He said, "The commission." "Fuck the commission," Anthony said, and the words hung in the air between them like the smoke from his cigarette, acrid and impossible to take back. "They're in New York. We're here. Gallo killed 3 of our men and you shook his hand. You smiled for the camera. What does that make us?" "Alive," Salvatore said. "It makes us alive, which is more than you'd be if you'd done what you're thinking about doing." Anthony turned from the window finally, and his eyes held something Salvatore hadn't seen before. Not just anger, something colder. Something that looked like disappointment, or worse, like pity. The boy said, "When Nonno ran things, nobody would have dared. They'd have known what it meant to cross the Coletti name. But you..." He didn't finish, didn't have to. Salvatore stood slowly, his knees complaining, his back complaining. Everything complaining, because that's what happened when you carried the weight of other men's lives for 30 years. He walked to his son, and when he was close enough to smell the pomade in Anthony's hair, the tobacco on his breath, he raised his hand, and for a moment the boy thought his father might hit him. Instead, Salvatore placed his palm against Anthony's cheek, gentle. The way he'd done when the boy was small and had woken from nightmares, he said, "I know what you think, that I'm weak, that I should have fought. Maybe you're right, but I'm your father, and I'm trying to keep you alive, even if you don't want to be kept." Anthony pulled away. His voice was thick when he spoke. "I didn't ask you to." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Salvatore stood alone in the back room, listening to his son's footsteps fade down the hall out into the cold November night. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, the good stuff he kept in the desk for occasions that mattered, and drank it standing up. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its uneasy sleep. Children dreaming behind triple-locked doors, men checking their weapons before they closed their eyes, women praying rosaries they'd stopped believing in years ago. And somewhere in the dark, in the space between respect and rage, a son made a decision his father couldn't stop. Salvatore felt it in his chest like a stone dropping into deep water. Felt it in the way the room seemed suddenly colder. The radiator's clank suddenly lonelier. He finished his drink and poured another, and though he was a man who'd long ago stopped asking God for favors, he found himself whispering a prayer he'd learned from his own father. A prayer in Sicilian, older than memory, that asked for protection over sons who thought themselves immortal. The words felt useless even as he spoke them. But he spoke them anyway because that's what fathers did when they'd already lost the war but hadn't yet been told. The Gallo brothers operated out of a warehouse on the Columbia Street docks, a 3-story brick building that smelled of salt and diesel, and the particular rot that comes from fish left too long in the sun. Giancarlo was the eldest, the one who made the decisions, but his brother Marco did the wet work. The kind of jobs that required a man who didn't flinch and didn't remember. They had a reputation in Red Hook that preceded them like a smell, the kind that made smart men cross the street, made mothers hurry their children past the warehouse doors, made even the cops who were on the payroll think twice before collecting their envelopes. The peace with Coletti was good for business. Everyone agreed on that. But it was also fragile. The kind of thing that required maintenance, reminders, a careful balance of fear and respect that kept both sides honest. Giancarlo understood this, which is why when one of his men came running into his office 3 days after the signing, face pale, and words tumbling over themselves, saying that Anthony Coletti had been seen asking questions about Marco's schedule, about where he drank, about who he kept company with, Giancarlo felt the first cold finger of something he hadn't felt in years. Not quite fear, not yet, but its cousin. The understanding that peace was about to get expensive. He sent for Marco immediately, found him in the warehouse basement where they kept the things that made strong men weak, the tools of persuasion that turned lies into confessions and confessions into silence. Marco came up with his sleeves rolled, his hands still wet from washing, and when Giancarlo told him about Anthony Coletti, about the questions, about the looks, Marco smiled the way a dog smiles when it catches a scent. He said, "So the pup's got teeth. Salvatore, no." "Salvatore signed the truce," Giancarlo said, "which means either he's lost control of his son or this is a test. Either way, we got a problem." Marco dried his hands on a towel, methodical, taking his time. He was built like a stevedore, thick across the chest and shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same wood as the docks he controlled. His face carried the map of old violence, a nose broken so many times it had given up trying to heal straight, a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw that he'd gotten from a straight razor in a fight whose details changed depending on who was telling the story. He dropped the towel and said, "You want me to talk to him?" "I want you to be careful," Giancarlo said. "The commission's watching this. We break the truce. We break it for good. But we can't let some kid think he can disrespect us either. That's worse. So what do you want?" Giancarlo lit a cigarette, offered one to his brother, who declined. He said, "I want you to have a conversation with young Anthony. Private, friendly. Make him understand that what happened before, that was business. This peace we got now, that's business too. And business means everyone plays by the rules. And if he doesn't want to understand, then you make him disappear. Quiet, no body, nothing that points back to us. And we tell Salvatore his son went to Florida for the winter. By the time anyone asks questions, the trail's cold and the story's set." He blew smoke at the ceiling, watched it curl and dissipate against the water-stained plaster. "But we do it careful, Marco. This one we do it like surgeons, clean, painless, like he never existed in the first place." Marco nodded, already working out the details in his head. Where, when, how to make it look like nothing at all. He'd done this before, more times than he cared to count, made men vanish from the world like they were chalk marks in the rain. It was his gift, his particular skill. Some men could move money, some could move product. Marco moved bodies, and more importantly, moved them so thoroughly that even God would have trouble finding them come Judgment Day. He said, "The kid's got people following him, father's people." "So you do it when he's alone," Giancarlo said. "Anthony's young, proud. He thinks he's smarter than the old men. That's the weakness. That's what you use." Marco left that night with 2 of his best men, quiet types who understood that the most important part of violence was the silence that came after. They drove through Red Hook in an old Packard with the headlights off, watching the streets, learning the patterns. They saw Anthony Coletti leave his father's club just after 1 in the morning, saw him walk alone down Union Street, with his hands in his pockets and his collar turned up against the wind, saw him stop at a corner to light a cigarette, the match flaring briefly against his face before dying, saw him keep walking, past the closed storefronts and the empty lots. past the places where men like him conducted business that the morning papers never reported. And they saw something else too. Something in the way the kid moved, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he looked at the shadows like he was expecting company. Marco saw it and understood immediately. The kid wasn't scared. The kid was hunting. He called off the follow that night, told his men to hang back, to watch but not engage. Something about the situation didn't sit right, and Marco had survived as long as he had by trusting the parts of his brain that spoke in feelings instead of words. He reported back to Giancarlo the next morning, said the kid was definitely making moves, asking questions, building towards something. But he was also being careful, staying in public, keeping his father's soldiers close even when he didn't think he was being watched. Smart kid. Dangerous kid. The kind that made you wonder if maybe Salvatore Coletti had raised him right after all. So we wait, Giancarlo said. Let him think he's got time. Let him get comfortable. Then we take him. They waited 3 days. 3 days during which Anthony Coletti continued his routine, continued asking his questions, continued building whatever case he thought he was building against the Gallo family. 3 days during which Red Hook held its breath without knowing why, the neighborhood existing in that peculiar state of tension that preceded violence, the way static preceded lightning. And on the third night, when Anthony left his father's club again, alone again, walking the same route he'd walked 100 times before, Marco and his men were ready. They found him on a side street off Columbia, away from the lights, away from witnesses. Marco stepped out from a doorway and said the kid's name, said it friendly, like they were old acquaintances running into each other by chance. Anthony stopped, turned, and his hand went immediately to his waistband, where everyone who mattered kept their insurance, but he didn't draw. Not yet. Just stood there in the cold with his breath pluming white, waiting to see what came next. Marco kept his hands visible, kept his voice casual. He said, "We should talk, you and me, man to man, about this situation that's developing." "I got nothing to say to you," Anthony said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were moving, cataloging exits, measuring distances. Good instincts. His father had taught him well. "That's fine," Marco said. "Then just listen. What happened before, that's done. Your father and my brother, they made peace. The commission blessed it. That means it's law now. You understand what I'm saying? It's not about respect anymore. It's not about who's harder or who's got more heart. It's about the rules. And the rules say we leave each other alone." "The rules also say you don't kill a man's soldiers," Anthony said. "But you did that. So what do the rules mean exactly?" Marco smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "They mean we're all still breathing, that's what they mean. Your father's smart enough to understand that. Question is, are you?" For a long moment, the street held them both in its cold grip. Snow had started to fall, small dry flakes that caught the streetlight and sparkled briefly before melting on the cobblestones. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and went silent. A window opened and closed, life continuing in the spaces between violence, indifferent to what men said to each other in the dark. Then Anthony did something that surprised Marco. He laughed, not loud, not mocking, just a quiet exhalation of breath that might have been humor or might have been something sadder. He said, "You think I'm stupid. You think I'm some kid who doesn't know how this works. But I know exactly how it works. I know what you did. I know why my father can't do anything about it. And I know that the only difference between him and me is I'm not ready to live with it yet." "Then you're not ready to live at all," Marco said, and the moment shifted. Something in the air changed temperature. The two men behind Marco moved slightly, their hands sliding into their coats. Anthony's hand tightened on his belt, fingers brushing metal. The street waited, but before anyone could make the decision that would end all decisions, headlights swept around the corner and a car pulled up beside them. A black Chrysler with too many men inside. Coletti men. They'd been following Anthony, after all, at a distance, the way his father had ordered. The kind of protection a son resents until it saves his life. The moment broke. Marco stepped back, raised his hands in a gesture of peace that fooled no one. He said, "Think about what I said, kid. Think about whether dying for your pride is worth what it'll cost your father to bury you." Then he and his men were gone, disappearing into the network of alleys and doorways they knew like the lines on their own palms. The Chrysler idled at the curb, and Paulie Moretti got out, his face grave, his voice quiet, when he said, "Your father wants to see you, now." Anthony didn't argue. He got in the car, and they drove through the snowfall back to Union Street, back to the club that smelled of cigars and coffee and the accumulated guilt of 3 generations. And sitting in the back, watching the neighborhood slide past the window, Anthony understood that the war had already started, not out in the street where everyone could see it, but in the smaller, more important space between what his father believed and what he knew to be true, between obedience and honor, between living on your knees and dying on your feet. The car turned the corner, and the snow kept falling, and somewhere in a warehouse on Columbia Street, Marco Gallo was already making plans that would change everything. Salvatore was waiting in the back room with a bottle between them, 2 glasses already poured. He didn't speak when Anthony entered, just gestured to the chair across from him, the one where men sat when their futures were being decided. Anthony sat. The radiator clanked. Outside, the snow had gotten heavier, muffling the city, turning Red Hook into something from a dream or a memory or both. Salvatore pushed 1 glass across the table, and his son took it but didn't drink, just held it, feeling the weight of the crystal, the cold of the whiskey inside. When his father finally spoke, his voice carried the weariness of a man who'd already lost, but was going through the motions anyway. "Paulie says the Gallo soldiers found you tonight," Salvatore said. "Says Marco himself came to talk." "He had something to say," Anthony replied. "I didn't particularly want to hear it." "But you listened." "I listened." Salvatore drank, set his glass down with a sound like a small bell. He said, "You know what you're doing, making them nervous, asking questions. You think I don't hear about it? Every conversation you have, every move you make, it gets back to me. And it gets back to them too. You're putting us in a position, Anthony, a bad one." "We were already in a position," Anthony said, "on our knees." The slap came fast, harder than Salvatore had intended, his hand connecting with his son's cheek with a crack that echoed in the small room. Anthony's head snapped sideways, but he didn't raise his hands, didn't move to defend himself. Just sat there with the red mark blooming on his face and his eyes locked on some point beyond his father's shoulder. Salvatore's hand hurt, his chest hurt, everything hurt. He said, his voice rough, "Don't you dare. Don't you dare make this about pride. I did what I had to do to keep this family alive, to keep you alive. If that means swallowing my rage, if that means shaking hands with the men who killed our people, then that's what it means. I'm your father. I don't need you to agree with me. I need you to obey me." Anthony touched his cheek, where the handprint was already fading to purple. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "Papa, do you remember what you told me when I made my first collection? I was 15. You sent me to that tailor on Hamilton Avenue, the one who owed money. You said, make him respect you, but make him fear you more, because respect is what keeps things civil, but fear is what keeps things real. You remember that?" "I remember," Salvatore said quietly. "So tell me, when you shook Giancarlo Gallo's hand in front of the commission, in front of everyone who matters, what did that make him feel? Respect or contempt?" Anthony leaned forward, and his eyes held his father's, unflinching. "You taught me everything I know about this life. You taught me that our name means something, that when someone crosses us there's a price, that the only thing a man has in this world is his reputation, and once you lose that, you're already dead. You taught me all of that, Papa, so don't be angry when I actually learned the lesson." Salvatore wanted to argue, wanted to explain about the commission, about the changing world, about the fact that the old ways were dying and survival now meant adaptation instead of stubbornness. But looking at his son's face, at the certainty there, the absolute conviction, he understood that he'd been right earlier. This wasn't about the gallows anymore. This was about him, about whether his son could respect a father who'd chosen peace over vengeance. And the sad truth, the thing that made Salvatore's chest feel like it was filled with broken glass, was that he wasn't sure he could give the answer either of them wanted. He said, "What are you going to do?" "What you would have done," Anthony said, "if you were still the man you used to be." The words hung between them like an indictment. Salvatore felt something inside him break, something fundamental that he'd been holding together through will alone for longer than he cared to remember. He said, his voice barely above a whisper, "If you do this, I can't protect you. The commission won't allow it. Giancarlo will have every right to respond, and I'll be forced to choose between you and everything I've built." "Then I guess you'll have to choose," Anthony said. He stood, drained his whiskey in one swallow, and set the glass down with a finality that sounded like a door closing. "But choose fast, Papa, because I'm done waiting for permission to be a man." He left. The door didn't slam this time, just closed with a soft click that was somehow worse than any amount of violence. Salvatore sat alone in the back room, staring at the empty chair across from him, and felt the terrible weight of understanding settle over him like a shroud. His son was going to die. Not might. Would. As certainly as the snow was falling outside, as certainly as the neighborhood slept its fitful sleep, Anthony Coletti was walking toward his own death, and Salvatore could see it as clearly as if it had already happened. He could see the casket, the black dresses, the women with their handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, could see himself standing at the grave, stone-faced and empty, being told by men in suits that this was the price of the life, that sons who didn't listen got what was coming, that maybe now the peace would hold. He poured himself another drink, and another after that, and by the time the bottle was half empty, the snow outside had piled high enough to muffle even the sound of his own breathing. The radiator had gone silent. The cold had won. And Salvatore Coletti, Don of Red Hook, respected by men from Boston to Chicago, feared by those who crossed him and loved by those he protected, sat in his club and wept like a child who'd lost something precious and couldn't remember where he'd put it. Somewhere in the dark, his son was planning murder, and somewhere in an office on Columbia Street, the Gallo brothers were planning the same. And between those two certainties, there was no space left for hope. Only the long cold wait until morning, when the blood would finally start to flow and everyone would learn what peace actually cost. The week that followed moved like a funeral procession, slow and inevitable, and touched with the kind of sorrow that no one speaks about but everyone feels. Red Hook went about its business the way it always did, the docks loading and unloading, the numbers runners making their collections, the speakeasies serving bootleg whiskey to men who drank because working was hard and living was harder. But underneath the routine there was a current of tension, a feeling in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the birds go quiet and the sky turns that peculiar shade of green that means shelter if you're smart and trouble if you're not. People noticed things they normally wouldn't. The way Coletti's men stood on corners with their hands in their pockets, not talking, just watching. The way the Gallo soldiers moved through the neighborhood in groups of 3 or 4, never alone, never careless. The way Anthony Coletti had stopped coming to his father's club in the evenings, stopped being seen at all except in quick glimpses. A figure in a doorway, a shadow crossing a street there and gone before you could be sure it was really him. Father Benedict, who'd baptized half the children in Red Hook and buried most of their grandparents, noticed too. He was 63 that winter, old enough to have seen this pattern before, to understand what silence meant when it came from men who normally couldn't stop talking. He made his rounds through the neighborhood like he did every week, visiting the sick, hearing confessions, offering what comfort the church allowed, and sometimes a bit more that it didn't. And on the Thursday before everything changed, he found himself climbing the stairs to Salvatore Coletti's apartment above the club, his cassock damp from the snow, his breath short from the effort. He knocked, and when Salvatore opened the door, the priest saw immediately what others had been too afraid to notice. The Don looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. His face had gone grey, his eyes hollow, as though something essential had been scooped out and replaced with ash. "Father," Salvatore said, and his voice carried surprise but also something like relief. "I wasn't expecting you. I'm not sure I was expecting me either," Father Benedict said. "But here we are. May I come in?" The apartment was small, neat in the way of men who lived alone, with furniture that had seen better days and photographs on the walls of people who'd seen better days as well. Salvatore's wife, dead 8 years from the cancer. His parents, stern-faced in their wedding portrait. Anthony as a boy, gap-toothed and smiling, holding a baseball bat like a sword. The priest sat in the chair he was offered, accepted the coffee that was poured, and waited. He'd learned long ago that confession came in its own time, that pressing made men defensive, made them retreat into the lies they told themselves to get through the day. Better to sit, to let the silence do the work, and sure enough, after a few minutes of small talk about the weather and the neighborhood and the latest news from Italy that no one cared about anymore, Salvatore set down his cup and said, "You came to talk about Anthony." "I came to talk about you," Father Benedict said, "but yes, Anthony too." Salvatore laughed, a sound without humor. Everyone's worried about Anthony, even the people who want him dead. Funny how that works. Are you worried? Every minute of every day. He stood, walked to the window, looked down at Union Street where snow had drifted against the buildings, like the neighborhood was slowly being buried. "I can see it coming, Father. Clear as anything. My son's going to do something stupid and he's going to die for it. And I'm going to have to stand there and pretend it was necessary, pretend it was the life, pretend that losing him doesn't tear me apart from the inside." He turned back, and his eyes were wet. "Tell me how a man lives with that. Tell me what prayer makes that bearable." Father Benedict was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know that any prayer does." "Maybe that's not what prayer's for. Then what's it for? For reminding us we're not alone in the suffering, that someone's listening, even if they're not answering." He paused, chose his next words carefully. "Salvatore, I've known you since you were Anthony's age. I baptized your son, I buried your wife, and I've never asked about your business because it's not my place. But I'll ask now, what exactly is your son planning?" Salvatore shook his head. "I don't know, not exactly, but I know him. I know what he thinks needs to happen. And I know that once he sets his mind to something, there's no talking him out of it. Like his father. Like his father used to be." The admission came hard, left something bitter in Salvatore's mouth. "I've gotten old, Father. Practical. I see angles now where I used to just see right and wrong. Anthony's still young enough to believe in clear lines, old enough to die for them. Can't you stop him? You're his father. You're the Don." "That's the problem," Salvatore said. "I can stop him as his Don. I can order him to back down, punish him if he doesn't. But if I do that, if I make it a command, then I'm choosing the gallows over my own blood. I'm saying their lives matter more than our honor. And once I say that, once that's known, then I'm not the Don anymore. I'm just an old man who lost his nerve." Father Benedict stood, moved to the window beside Salvatore, and together they looked out at the neighborhood that both men loved in different ways, for different reasons. The priest said, "You know what I think the hardest part of being a father is? It's not protecting your children from the world. It's protecting them from themselves, from the parts of them that are you, the parts you recognize because you've lived them. You can't save him from making your mistakes, Salvatore. You can only decide whether you'll be there when he needs you, after he's made them. And if he dies, then you grieve, like every father who's lost a son, like Abraham would have grieved if God hadn't stopped his hand." He put a hand on Salvatore's shoulder, felt the tension there, the coiled strength that came from carrying too much for too long. "But you don't give up. You don't let his death be meaningless. You make sure something good comes from it, even if that good is just you becoming the man he thought you were." Salvatore said nothing for a long time, just stood there with the priest's hand on his shoulder and the snow falling outside and his son somewhere in the city making plans that would destroy them both. Finally he said, "Will you pray with me, Father? I don't know what else to do." They prayed there in the apartment. Two men speaking words in Latin that had been spoken for 2,000 years by people who also didn't know what else to do. And when they finished, when Father Benedict had made the sign of the cross and gathered his coat to leave, Salvatore felt no better, no more certain, but he felt less alone, which wasn't much, but it was something. And in the life Salvatore Coletti had chosen, in the world he'd built and maintained and sacrificed for, sometimes something was all you got. Anthony spent that same Thursday in a basement on President Street, 3 blocks from where he'd grown up, in a building owned by a man who owed favors to the Coletti family going back to Salvatore's father. The basement smelled of oil and concrete, of mice and the particular damp that came from being below street level in a city built on fill. There were two others with him. Carlo Benedetti, who'd grown up on the same block, who'd gotten his first kiss from the same girl, who'd stood beside Anthony at his mother's funeral, and never asked questions when the answers would have been uncomfortable. And James Sullivan, who everyone called Sully, whose grandfather had come over from County Cork, and whose father had married an Italian girl against both families' wishes, creating a son who belonged to both worlds and neither. They were loyal. They were young. They were stupid in the way that young men with something to prove are always stupid, confusing courage with recklessness, honor with pride. They'd been planning for a week, sketching out routes and timings on paper that they'd burn afterward, studying the patterns of Marco Gallo's movements the way students studied textbooks. Marco was careful, they'd learned. He traveled in a car with two men, varied his routes, never stayed anywhere too long. But careful men had patterns too. They just took longer to find, and Anthony had been patient, watching, waiting, until finally he'd seen it. Every Sunday morning, Marco went to Mass at St. Stephen's on Summit Street. He went alone, or as alone as a man like that ever was, just him and the driver waiting in the car while Marco lit his candles and said his prayers and pretended that the blood on his hands washed off with holy water. It was the only moment of vulnerability in Marco Gallo's entire week, and it was the moment Anthony intended to use. "You're sure about this?" Carlo asked. He was sitting on an upturned crate, cleaning his revolver with a rag that had seen better days. His hands were steady, but his voice carried doubt. "Once we do this, there's no going back. My father made his choice," Anthony said. "Now I'm making mine." Sully was at the window, looking up at the street level where legs passed by, anonymous and hurried. He said without turning, "The commission's going to come down on us, hard. You know that, right? They brokered the peace. We break it. We're not just fighting the gallows. We're fighting everyone." "Then we better not miss," Anthony said. He spread the map across the table, a hand-drawn thing showing the blocks around St. Stephen's, the alleys, the exits, the sightlines. He'd drawn it himself from memory, walking the route a dozen times until he could have navigated it blind. He pointed with a pencil, his movements precise, confident. Marco goes to the 8 o'clock Mass, gets there at 7:45, stays until the end, leaves by 9. The driver parks on Summit, always in the same spot because it's close to the door. "We wait in the alley here," he tapped the map. "And when Marco comes out, when he's between the church and the car, that's when we move. 3 seconds, maybe 5. Then we're gone before anyone even understands what happened." "What about his driver?" Carlo asked. "Sully handles the driver. You and me take Marco." Anthony looked up, met his friend's eyes. "I don't want him wounded. I don't want him suffering. Just dead. Clean. Professional. The way it should have been done to our people." Carlo nodded slowly, then said the thing they were all thinking. "Your father's going to know it was us. Even if we don't get caught, even if we're smart about it, he'll know." "I'm counting on it," Anthony said. "I'm counting on everyone knowing, because that's the point. The gallows need to understand that the Coletti name still means something, that we don't forgive, that we don't forget, and we sure as hell don't bend the knee just because some men in New York say we should." He rolled up the map, tucked it into his coat. "This is bigger than me, bigger than my father. This is about whether our word means anything, whether respect is still currency, or if we've all just become errand boys for whoever has the commission's ear this week." The three of them stood there in the basement, young men on the edge of violence, each one understanding that what came next would define them for whatever time they had left, would make them legends or cautionary tales, depending on how the next 72 hours played out. Carlo holstered his pistol. Sully turned from the window, and Anthony looked at them both, these friends who'd become brothers, who'd chosen to follow him into the dark without guarantees, without promises, with nothing but the thin hope that doing the right thing mattered more than surviving. He said, "Sunday morning, 7:30. We meet 2 blocks west in the alley behind the butcher shop. And if you want out, if either of you wants out, I won't hold it against you. This is my father's war, not yours." "Your father's war is our war," Carlo said. "That's how this works." Sully just nodded, and the three of them climbed the stairs back into the cold December afternoon, each man carrying the weight of what was coming, the knowledge that Sunday would arrive whether they were ready or not. They split up on the street, heading in different directions to different lives that would only intersect again when blood called for blood. And in his apartment above the club on Union Street, Salvatore Coletti stood at his window and watched his son disappear into the crowd, and knew without being told that the decision had been made, the plan was set, and all that remained was the terrible wait until the moment when everything he'd tried to prevent would finally come to pass. Saturday arrived with the kind of cold that made your teeth ache, that turned breath to ice in your lungs, and made the city feel abandoned even though millions still moved through it. Father Benedict said early Mass at St. Stephen's, fewer than a dozen in the pews, old women mostly, the kind who came not because they believed anymore, but because the routine was all they had left. He blessed them, gave communion to those who approached, and afterward stood in the vestibule watching snow fall on Summit Street and thinking about the conversation he'd had with Salvatore Coletti. Something was coming. He could feel it the way animals felt earthquakes before they hit, some instinct older than reason, warning that the ground was about to shift. He prayed for wisdom. He prayed for mercy. He prayed that whatever was coming would somehow pass over the innocent, though he knew from long experience that innocence was never protection enough. Across the neighborhood, in the warehouse on Columbia Street, Giancarlo Gallo was having his own moment of unease. Marco had reported that Anthony Coletti had gone quiet, stopped asking questions, stopped being seen. On the surface that was good, meant maybe the kid had listened, maybe the threat had worked. But Giancarlo hadn't survived this long by trusting the surface. Silence from a man like Anthony, silence from a man with his pride and his rage, didn't mean surrender. It meant preparation. He told Marco to be extra careful, to vary his patterns, to trust no one. But Marco had laughed it off, said the kid was all talk, said if Anthony wanted to try something he'd be ready. And maybe he would be. Marco had been doing this since Anthony was in diapers, but Giancarlo still felt the unease. Felt it like a stone in his chest that wouldn't dislodge no matter how much whiskey he poured on top of it. At home, Salvatore sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold between his hands. He hadn't slept in 2 days, couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten anything that hadn't turned to ash in his mouth. His men kept asking if he was all right, if he needed anything. And he kept telling them he was fine, just tired, just getting old. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. He was waiting for his son to die, not doing anything to stop it, not calling the commission, not reaching out to the gallows to broker some kind of last-minute peace, just waiting. Because to act now would be to admit that he'd lost control, that the Don of Red Hook couldn't control his own blood, and that admission would end him as surely as a bullet. So he sat, and he waited, and he felt each hour pass like a small death, like a rehearsal for the real grief that was coming. Anthony spent Saturday afternoon in church, not St. Stephen's but St. Paul's on Court Street, a smaller place where he wasn't likely to be recognized. He lit candles for his mother, for his grandfather, for the 3 men the gallows had killed. He sat in the back pew and let the incense wash over him, let the Latin words the priest murmured at the altar fill the spaces between his thoughts. He wasn't praying exactly, didn't know who he'd be praying to or what he'd ask for, just sitting, letting the silence work on him the way silence works on all men eventually, wearing down certainty, exposing the raw places underneath. He thought about his father, about the look on Salvatore's face when Anthony had walked out, that mixture of anger and heartbreak and resignation that suggested he'd already accepted what was coming. Part of Anthony wanted to go back, to tell his father he was sorry, that he understood now what the old man had been trying to protect him from. But the larger part, the part that had been raised to value honor over happiness, knew that going back would be worse than going forward. That some things, once set in motion, had to play out to their end. He left the church as evening fell, walked through streets transformed by snow into something cleaner than they actually were, saw children playing, throwing snowballs, laughing with the kind of abandon that only came from not knowing yet what the world cost, saw couples hurrying home to apartments where they'd light fires and make love and pretend that warmth was permanent, saw old men in doorways watching everything with eyes that had seen it all before, and knew exactly how it ended. And he felt, for just a moment, the terrible weight of what he was about to do. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The understanding that after tomorrow he'd be different, that the boy who'd played on these streets, who'd kissed girls in doorways and believed his father was invincible, would be gone forever, replaced by something harder, something that could live with blood on its hands and sleep through the night anyway. He met with Carlo and Sully one last time that evening in the basement where they'd planned. Checked weapons, went over the timing, made sure everyone understood their role. Sully would take the driver first, a clean shot through the window before the man could react. Carlo and Anthony would handle Marco, 2 guns firing simultaneously, no margin for error. Then they'd scatter, 3 different directions, 3 different safe houses, and not contact each other for a week. Simple, professional. The kind of thing that either worked perfectly or got you killed trying. They shook hands at the end, and each man carried a knowledge he couldn't speak, that this might be the last time they saw each other. That friendship, like everything else in this life, was temporary. That the only thing permanent was the reputation you left behind. Anthony walked home through snow that was still falling, that seemed like it would never stop, like maybe the whole world would be buried eventually under this quiet white erasure. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, unlocked the door, and found his father sitting in the dark. Salvatore didn't speak, didn't move. Just sat there in the chair by the window, his silhouette outlined by streetlight, his hands folded in his lap like he was at a wake. Anthony froze in the doorway, one hand still on the knob, his heart suddenly loud in his chest. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Salvatore said, his voice rough with everything he wasn't saying, "You used to have nightmares when you were small. You'd wake up screaming, convinced there were monsters under your bed. And I'd come in and I'd check under the bed and I'd tell you there was nothing there, that you were safe, that I'd never let anything hurt you." He turned his head slightly, and in the dim light Anthony could see his face, see the wetness on his cheeks. "I lied to you then. I'm not going to lie to you now. There are monsters. They're real. And tomorrow you're going to become one of them." "Papa," Anthony started, but Salvatore raised a hand. Don't tell me I'm wrong. Don't tell me you have to do this. I know you have to. I know because I raised you to think that honor matters more than survival, and now I have to live with that." He stood, walked to the door, stopped beside his son. Up close, he looked ancient, like the 30 years of this life had finally caught up with him all at once. He put a hand on Anthony's cheek, the same gesture he'd made the night they'd argued, but gentler now, weighted with farewell. "When it's done, when they come for you, because they will come for you, don't fight it. Don't make me choose between you and everything else. Just go, disappear. Let me tell people you ran. Let me save face while I'm burying my son." "I'm not going to run," Anthony said. "I know," Salvatore whispered. "That's why I'm saying goodbye now." He left, and Anthony stood alone in his apartment, surrounded by the possessions of a life he was about to leave behind. Photos, books, clothes that would still be hanging in the closet long after he was gone. He should have felt something, he thought. Fear, maybe. Regret. But there was only a strange calm, a sense of inevitability that felt almost like peace. He undressed, lay down in bed, and to his surprise he slept. Dreamless. Deep. The sleep of a man who'd made his decision and had nothing left to decide. And outside, the snow kept falling, burying Red Hook beneath its silent weight, erasing footprints, covering sins, making everything look new until morning came and revealed that nothing had changed at all. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear, the storm having passed in the night, leaving the city wrapped in pristine white that would turn to grey slush by noon, but for now held the illusion of purity. St. Stephen's bells began ringing at 7:15, calling the faithful to Mass, their sound echoing off brick and concrete in a way that made the neighborhood feel older, more permanent than it was. Marco Gallo's driver pulled up to the curb at 7:43, 2 minutes earlier than usual, and Marco emerged from the warehouse with his coat collar turned up and his hands in his pockets. He'd been doing this for 20 years, this ritual of Sunday Mass, this small concession to his mother's memory and her belief that even men like him could be saved, if they just asked forgiveness often enough. He didn't believe it himself, didn't think that lighting candles and murmuring prayers erased the things he'd done in the dark. But he did it anyway, because that's what you did. You honored your mother, even if you dishonored everything else. The driver, a man named Paulie, who'd worked for the gallows since before Marco could drive, kept the engine running while Marco walked the 40 feet to St. Stephen's front door. The street was quiet, just a few early risers heading to Mass, old women in black dresses and heavy coats, men with newspapers tucked under their arms. Normal. The kind of morning that made you forget that violence lived in this neighborhood, the way cold lived in winter. Always present, always waiting for a chance to remind you it was there. Marco climbed the steps, pulled open the heavy wooden door, and stepped into the vestibule where votive candles flickered and the smell of incense was already thick. Father Benedict was at the altar, his back to the congregation preparing for the service. Marco crossed himself, dipped his fingers in holy water, and slid into a pew near the back where he always sat, where he could see the door and anyone who came through it. 2 blocks away, in an alley behind a butcher shop that wouldn't open for another 3 hours, Anthony Coletti checked his pistol one last time. It was a Colt M1911, his grandfather's gun, carried through the First War and brought home to Red Hook, where it had been used for purposes the old man had never intended. The metal was cold against Anthony's palm, the weight of it familiar, comforting even. He tucked it into his waistband at the small of his back, covered it with his coat and looked at Carlo and Sully. Both men were pale, their breath coming in short white puffs, their eyes bright with adrenaline and fear in equal measure. Anthony said, "Remember, fast, clean, no hesitation. The moment Marco comes out that door, we move. Understood?" They nodded. Sully checked his own weapon, a revolver that had belonged to his father, that carried its own weight of history and expectation. Carlo flexed his fingers, working, feeling back into them. And for just a second, Anthony saw him as he'd been at 12 years old, gap-toothed and laughing, before the neighborhood had taught them both that laughter was something you saved for when you were alone. Then the moment passed, and they were just 3 men preparing to commit murder on a Sunday morning while the church bells rang. They left the alley, moved through the quiet streets with their hands in their pockets and their eyes forward. Just 3 more neighborhood boys heading somewhere, anywhere. Unremarkable until the moment they became history. Inside St. Stephen's, Father Benedict began the Mass. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. The congregation responded in unison, voices low and worn from decades of repetition. Marco mouthed the words without thinking, his mind elsewhere running through the day ahead. He had collections to oversee, men to meet, business that needed attention. The peace with the Colettis had held for 2 weeks now, and he was starting to think maybe it would stick. Maybe the kid had listened after all. Part of him was almost disappointed. He'd been ready for Anthony to make a move, had been looking forward to it even, teaching the kid a final lesson about respect and consequences. But if the kid had backed down, well, that was fine too. Less messy, less risk of the commission getting involved. He could live with it. The service continued. Readings from scripture that Marco had heard 100 times, promises of redemption and forgiveness that felt like fairy tales told to children to help them sleep. When the time came for communion, Marco stood with the others, shuffled forward in line, accepted the wafer on his tongue with the solemnity the moment required. The priest blessed him, moved on to the next soul in need of saving. And Marco returned to his pew, knelt, closed his eyes, and for just a moment allowed himself to believe that his mother was right, that this meant something, that somewhere beyond the ceiling and the sky and the cold eternity above, someone was keeping score, and maybe the numbers weren't as bad as they felt. The Mass ended at 8:52. Father Benedict gave the final blessing, dismissed the congregation with words that had been spoken for centuries by men who believed them more than he did. The faithful filed out slowly, bundled against the cold, heading home to breakfasts and families and lives that would continue in the same grooves they'd worn for years. Marco waited until the pews had mostly emptied, then stood, crossed himself again more from habit than conviction, and walked toward the door. The morning light through the stained glass cast colored shadows across the floor, reds and blues and yellows that made the old wood look almost beautiful. He pushed through the heavy door into the vestibule, then through the outer door into the December morning. The cold hit him first, then the sun, low and bright, making him squint. He started down the steps, his eyes adjusting, his mind already moving forward to the day's business. And he never saw them. Never saw Anthony step from the alley 40 feet away with his grandfather's pistol already drawn. Never saw Carlo beside him, weapon raised, face set in determination that looked almost like grief. Never registered the movement, the threat, the fact that he'd been wrong about the kid backing down. He only heard Father Benedict's voice, sudden and sharp, shouting "Non Saul" from the doorway behind him. Only felt the sudden electric understanding that something was wrong, that danger was present, that he needed to move. His hand went to his waist where he kept his own insurance, his body already turning, already trying to save itself. But he was too late. He'd always been too late. From the moment Anthony Coletti had decided this was necessary, from the moment pride and honor had required blood, Marco Gallo's death had been written in ink that couldn't be erased. The first shot took him in the chest, spun him sideways. The second caught him as he fell high in the shoulder. He hit the steps hard, his vision already graying, his mouth filling with the copper taste of his own death. Somewhere in the distance he could hear screaming, the driver's door opening, more gunfire, rapid, overlapping, the sound echoing off the buildings like thunder. Then nothing, just the cold stone beneath him and the sky above, and the slow red spread of his blood mixing with the snow. His last thought, before the dark took him completely, was that his mother had been right. Someone had been keeping score, and the numbers were exactly as bad as they'd felt. The driver, Paulie, died in the car. 3 shots through the window before he'd even gotten his hand on his weapon, his blood turning the windshield into an abstract painting that nobody would ever appreciate. Sully fired them all, smooth and professional, just the way Anthony had taught him, then turned and ran east toward the docks where a boat was waiting, where escape was possible if he moved fast enough and luck was with him. Carlo fired the last shot at Marco, the insurance policy, making sure the job was done, then bolted west toward the network of alleys he'd known since childhood. And Anthony stood there for 1 second longer than he should have, looking at Marco Gallo's body on the church steps, at the blood pooling beneath him, at the absolute finality of what had just been done. He felt nothing. No triumph, no regret. Just the cold fact of it, the thing that was now true and could never be untrue. He'd killed a man. Not in self-defense, not in the heat of passion, but deliberately, methodically, because honor demanded it. And in that second of stillness he understood that his father had been right. He'd become something different, something that could look at death and feel nothing at all. Then Father Benedict was running down the steps, his cassock billowing, his face a mask of horror and fury. And Anthony was moving, the moment breaking, his legs carrying him north toward the safe house on Sackett Street, where he'd wait out the first wave of response, where he'd learn whether the plan had worked or whether he'd just committed the most spectacular suicide in Red Hook's history. He ran through alleys and across streets, his breath burning in his lungs, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, the neighborhood was waking to murder, doors opening, voices raised, someone shouting to call the police. But by the time the black and whites arrived with their sirens wailing, by the time Giancarlo Gallo got the phone call that would turn his morning into a nightmare, Anthony Coletti was gone, disappeared into the city like smoke, like a ghost, like a son who'd finally made his father's worst fears come true. The news spread through Red Hook faster than the police could contain it. Marco Gallo, dead on the steps of St. Stephen's, shot down on a Sunday morning while Father Benedict watched. The kind of violation that transcended business, that made even hardened men cross themselves and wonder what the world was coming to. By noon, the street in front of the church was crowded with people, gawkers and mourners and cops, trying to keep some semblance of order while they collected shell casings and took statements from witnesses who'd all somehow been looking the wrong direction when it happened. By 2 o'clock, Giancarlo Gallo was on his way to Brooklyn with a convoy of soldiers and a rage so pure it felt like divine inspiration. And by 4 o'clock, When Salvatore Coletti's phone finally rang with the call he'd been dreading, the Don of Red Hook understood that his son hadn't just broken the truce, he'd destroyed it, burned it to ash, made it impossible for anyone to pretend that peace had ever been real. Salvatore took the call in his office, standing, his hand tight around the receiver, his face carefully blank. The voice on the other end belonged to Giuseppe Masseria, the Commission's representative in New York, and it carried the weight of judgment passed by men who didn't ask questions because they already knew the answers. Masseria said, "Your son killed Marco Gallo this morning, on church steps, in front of a priest. I'm calling as a courtesy, Salvatore, because we've known each other a long time. But this courtesy only goes so far. You have 24 hours to produce Anthony, or the Commission authorizes Giancarlo to handle this his way, which means we won't be able to protect you, won't be able to protect anyone. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand," Salvatore said quietly. "Do you know where he is?" "No." "If you're lying—" "I'm not lying," Salvatore said, and it was true. He didn't know where Anthony had gone, what hole he'd crawled into to wait out the storm. Didn't know if the boy was scared or exhilarated or already regretting what he'd done. Didn't know anything except that his son was now a dead man walking, that the only question was when and how, not if. He said, "Giuseppe, I need to ask something. You're not in a position to ask anything. I'm asking anyway. When they find him, when they kill him, make sure it's fast. Make sure he doesn't suffer. He's my son. Whatever he did, whatever this costs, he's still my son." There was a long pause. Then Masseria said, his voice softer, touched with something that might have been pity, "I'll do what I can, but I can't promise anything. Giancarlo wants blood, and he's got every right to it. The best thing for everyone is if Anthony doesn't resist, if he takes what's coming like a man." Another pause. "I'm sorry, Salvatore. I really am." The line went dead. Salvatore set the receiver back in its cradle with hands that had started to shake, the tremor small but unstoppable, the physical manifestation of everything breaking inside him. He walked to the window, looked down at Union Street where life continued despite everything, children playing in the snow, men heading to their jobs or their vices, the neighborhood grinding on because that's what neighborhoods did. And he thought about his son, about the boy who'd played stickball on this very street, who'd come home with skinned knees and a smile that could break your heart, about the man that boy had become, driven by codes Salvatore himself had taught him, dying now for principles that suddenly felt like the most expensive luxury in the world. He wanted to cry, wanted to rage, wanted to turn back time to the moment when he'd had a choice, when he could have said no to this life, could have taken his family and run to some place where violence was a news story instead of a way of being. But time didn't work that way. And choices, once made, echoed forward until they either saved you or destroyed you. Usually the latter. He picked up the phone again, dialed a number he'd sworn he'd never call. When Anthony answered, his voice was calm, controlled, the voice of a man who'd accepted what was coming. Salvatore said, "They gave me 24 hours to bring you in." "Then you have a decision to make," Anthony said. "No, you do." Salvatore's voice broke, just slightly, just enough to reveal the cracks beneath. "You can run right now. I've got money hidden enough to get you out of the country. To set you up somewhere the Commission can't reach. South America, maybe. Or you can stay and you can die because that's what's coming. There's no third option." "There's always a third option," Anthony said. "I can fight." "Against what? Against everyone. You killed a made man, Anthony, on church property in front of a priest. There's no coming back from that. No amount of fighting changes it." He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, closed his eyes. "Please, please, I'm begging you. Run. Let me tell them you got away. Let me have something left of you, even if it's just knowing you're alive somewhere I can't see you." "I can't do that, Papa." "Why not?" "Because you taught me better." Anthony's voice was gentle, almost sad. "You taught me that a man's word is everything, that what we are is defined by what we do when everything's against us. You taught me that running is worse than dying, so I can't run, even if I wanted to, even if you're right and I'm wrong. I just can't." Salvatore felt something break inside him, something fundamental that had been holding him together through will alone. He said, "Then this is goodbye." "Yeah," Anthony said softly. "I guess it is. I love you. I should have said it more. I should have..." But the words wouldn't come, choked by grief and rage, and the terrible understanding that he'd failed in the only job that mattered. He'd kept his son alive for 23 years, taught him everything he knew, and it still wasn't enough. "Goodbye, Anthony." "Goodbye, Papa." The line went dead for the second time in 10 minutes, and Salvatore stood there with the phone in his hand, feeling the full weight of what was coming. His son was going to die. Not might, would. And there was nothing left to do but wait for the call that would tell him it was finished, that the debt had been paid. That Red Hook could return to whatever passed for peace, in a world where fathers outlived sons, and honor cost more than anyone should ever have to pay. Anthony spent his last night in an apartment above a bakery on Smith Street, a safe house that belonged to a distant cousin who'd agreed to look the other way for 24 hours and then forget he'd ever heard the Coletti name. The room was small, spare, with a single window that looked out on an alley where cats fought over territory and garbage. He could hear the ovens below, the bakers starting their pre-dawn work, the smell of bread rising through the floorboards like a memory of something pure. He sat in the dark with his grandfather's pistol on the table beside him and tried to make sense of what he'd done. Tried to feel something beyond the strange calm that had settled over him since the moment he'd pulled the trigger. He'd killed a man, had looked into Marco Gallo's eyes in that final second and seen the recognition there, the understanding that death had arrived and there would be no bargaining with it. And Anthony had felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt. Just the cold mechanical action of his finger on the trigger, the recoil traveling up his arm. The way Marco had spun and fallen like a puppet with cut strings. It should have meant something, he thought. Should have felt like victory or justice or whatever word you use to make murder palatable. But it had just felt like work, like checking an item off a list. One more task completed in service of something larger than himself. He thought about his father, about the conversation they'd had, the desperation in Salvatore's voice when he'd offered escape, offered money, offered anything except the one thing Anthony actually wanted, which was for his father to tell him he'd been right, that killing Marco had been necessary, had restored the family's honor, had meant something. But Salvatore couldn't say that, could never say that, because saying it would mean admitting that the peace had been wrong, that the commission had been wrong, that 20 years of careful diplomacy and measured response had been wrong. And that was a truth too expensive for a Don to acknowledge. So they'd said goodbye instead, and the space between them had grown too wide to cross. Around 3 in the morning, Anthony heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy, multiple sets. He picked up the pistol, checked the chamber, and waited. But when the door opened, it wasn't Gallo soldiers. It was Father Benedict, breathless from the climb, his cassock dusty from the street. The priest stood in the doorway, backlit by the hall light, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Then Father Benedict said, "I thought I might find you here. Your father told me about this place, years ago. He thought I should know, in case I ever needed to help someone disappear." "Did he send you?" Anthony asked. "No, I came because I watched you kill a man this morning, on the steps of my church, while I was standing there. And I thought maybe you'd want to confess." Anthony laughed, a sound without humor. "I'm not sorry for what I did." "I'm not asking for sorry," Father Benedict said. He came into the room, closed the door behind him, and sat heavily in the only chair. "I'm offering you a chance to talk to someone before it's too late to talk to anyone. Why? You think it'll save my soul? I think it might help you understand what you've done, help you carry it if nothing else." The priest leaned forward, his face grave in the dim light. "Anthony, I've known you since you were a baby. I baptized you. I gave you First Communion. And I've watched you grow into a man who thinks violence is the answer to every question. But it's not. It's just the thing that ends the conversation. Marco Gallo is dead. Your father's heartbroken, and you're sitting here waiting to die because you think that's what honor requires. But what if honor is just another word for pride? What if everything you think you're dying for is just the lie men tell themselves to justify the things they want to do anyway?" Anthony was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "When I was 10 years old, my father took me to meet his father, My grandfather, he was dying cancer, had maybe a week left, and I sat by his bed while he told me stories about the old country, about coming to America, about building something from nothing in a place that didn't want us. And at the end, right before I left, he grabbed my hand and he said, "Never forget who you are. Never let anyone make you small. The Coletti name means something. Make sure it always does." Those were his last words to me, Father, his dying wish. So you tell me, was I supposed to ignore that? Was I supposed to let Marco Gallo and the Commission and everyone else in this world tell me that our name doesn't matter anymore? That we should just accept disrespect and call it peace? Your grandfather was dying, Father Benedict said gently. The dying say a lot of things, it doesn't mean they're right. He was right about this. Was he? Because from where I'm sitting, the Coletti name is about to die with you. Your father's going to lose his son, maybe lose his position, maybe lose everything he's built. For what? For a moment of revenge that no one will remember in a year. That's not honor, Anthony, that's just waste. Anthony stood, walked to the window, looked down at the alley where dawn was starting to gray the sky. He said, "Maybe you're right, maybe I'm wrong, but it's done now, can't undo it, can't take back the bullet, so the only question left is what I do with whatever time I have left. You could run, your father offered you." "I can't run, won't run." He turned back to the priest and his face was set, determined, touched with something that looked like peace. "I did what I thought was right. What I was taught was right, and if I die for it, at least I die as myself, not as some version that bent itself into shapes to please other people." Father Benedict stood, walked to Anthony, and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. He said, "Then I'll pray for you, for your soul, for your father, for all of us caught in this life we didn't choose, but can't seem to escape." He made the sign of the cross over Anthony's head, murmured a blessing in Latin that had been said over dying men for centuries. Then he left, his footsteps receding down the stairs, leaving Anthony alone with his choices and his certainty, and the cold grey dawn that was breaking over Brooklyn like a judgment. They came for him just after noon, not the police, who were still sorting through witnesses and evidence, and the jurisdictional nightmare of a mob hit on church property. The Gallo soldiers, 8 of them, led by Giancarlo himself, because this was personal now, because Marco had been his brother, and some things you didn't delegate. They came up the stairs quietly, professionally, with weapons drawn and faces set in that particular blank expression that preceded violence. And Anthony, who'd been listening to the street all morning, who'd heard the cars pull up and the doors close, with the particular sound of men who meant business, was ready. He could have fought, could have gone down shooting, taken maybe 1 or 2 with him before they filled the room with lead and ended it. That's what movies made it look like, what the stories said about men who died with honor. But standing there with his grandfather's pistol in his hand, with 8 professionals on the other side of the door, and nowhere to run, even if he'd wanted to, Anthony understood that fighting was just another word for making it worse, for ensuring that his death would be slow and painful instead of quick and clean, for giving the gallows justification to hurt his father, to dismantle everything Salvatore had built because a son had been too proud to accept what was coming. So when they kicked in the door, when they flooded into the small room with their weapons raised and their fingers on triggers, Anthony did the only thing that made sense anymore. He set his pistol down on the table, raised his hands and said, "I'm not armed. I'm not resisting. Let's just get this over with." Giancarlo Gallo stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled rage, his brother's blood still fresh enough to smell. He looked at Anthony like you'd look at something that needed to be erased from the world, something offensive to the natural order. He said, "You got a lot of nerve, kid. I'll give you that." "I did what had to be done," Anthony said calmly. "Your brother killed 3 of ours, I killed 1 of yours, now we're even." "Even?" Giancarlo laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think that's how this works? You think you can kill a made man, break the Commission's truce, spit on everything we've built, and call it even? You're stupider than I thought." "Then what's the number?" Anthony asked. "How many Colettis do you need dead before your pride's satisfied? Me, my father, the whole neighborhood? Or is this one of those things where there's never enough blood? Where you keep taking and taking until everyone's in the ground and you can pretend you won something? Giancarlo crossed the room fast, backhanded Anthony across the face hard enough to split his lip, to send him stumbling against the wall. Anthony tasted blood, spat, and straightened up. Didn't raise his hands to defend himself, didn't fight back. Just stood there taking it, because that was the only power he had left. The power to control how he died, to make it mean something, even if that meaning was only clear to him. Giancarlo raised his hand again, but one of his soldiers put a hand on his shoulder, murmured something about the commission wanting this clean, wanting it official. Giancarlo lowered his hand, breathed hard through his nose, and stepped back. "You got family?" he asked. "My father." "Anyone else? Wife? Kids?" "No." "Good. Makes this simpler." He nodded to his men, and they moved forward, grabbing Anthony's arms, forcing them behind his back. Anthony didn't resist. Just let them cuff his wrists, let them search him for weapons he didn't have, let them do what they needed to do to feel like they'd won something. Giancarlo watched all of this with eyes that held no satisfaction, no victory, just the tired understanding of a man who'd done this too many times, who'd learned that revenge never tasted as good as you thought it would. He said, "You know what happens now." "I know," Anthony said. "You got anything you want to say? Any last words for your father?" Anthony thought about it, thought about all the things he could say, should say, that he was sorry, that he loved his father despite everything, that he hoped Salvatore would forgive him, would understand that he'd done what he thought was right, even if he'd been wrong. But none of those words felt adequate, felt like they'd carry the weight he needed them to carry. So instead he said, "Tell him I wasn't scared at the end. Tell him I went like a Coletti." That's what he'd want to know. Giancarlo nodded slowly, and for just a moment, something passed between them. Not respect exactly, but recognition. The understanding that they were both products of the same system, that given different circumstances, they might have been friends instead of enemies, that the things that separated them were arbitrary and ancient and utterly impossible to overcome. He said, "For what it's worth, kid, I wish it hadn't come to this. Your father's a good man, he didn't deserve this." "Neither did yours," Anthony said quietly. "But here we are." They took him down the stairs, through the bakery where the workers all found somewhere else to look, out into the December afternoon, where the sun was already starting to set even though it was barely 3 o'clock. A car waited at the curb, black and anonymous, and they pushed Anthony into the back seat between two soldiers who kept their weapons visible but not threatening. Professional, efficient. The kind of thing that happened a dozen times in Brooklyn every year and never made the papers, because everyone involved understood that this was business, that this was how the world worked, that some debts could only be paid in blood. They drove east, toward Coney Island, toward the ocean where the city ended and became something else. Anthony watched the neighborhoods slide past the window, each one familiar, each one carrying memories of the boy he'd been before this life had claimed him. He saw the playground where he'd learned to fight, the corner store where he'd bought candy, the church where his mother was buried, saw the accumulation of his 23 years compressed into a 15-minute drive that ended at a pier no one used anymore, where fishermen had once unloaded their catch, but now there was just rotting wood and the smell of low tide. They pulled Anthony from the car, walked him to the end of the pier where the Atlantic spread out dark and infinite, and Giancarlo said, "You want a priest?" "No," Anthony said. "I said my goodbyes." "You want it in the head or the heart? Does it matter?" "Not to me, but some men have preferences." Anthony looked out at the water, at the way the dying sun made it look almost beautiful, and thought about his father, about everything Salvatore had tried to teach him, everything he'd tried to protect him from. And he understood finally what the old man had known all along, that this life didn't care about honor or pride or who was right. It just cared about power, about who had it and who didn't, about the 1,000 ways men hurt each other and called it necessary. He'd thought killing Marco would restore something, would prove something. But all it had done was add another body to the pile, another story to the neighborhood's endless catalogue of violence. His grandfather's dying words hadn't been wisdom, they'd been a curse, a chain around Anthony's neck that had dragged him down to this pier, to this moment, to the last few seconds before everything stopped. He said, "Tell my father I understand now. Tell him he was right and I was stupid. Tell him... But he couldn't finish. Couldn't find words for the enormity of what he felt. So he just said, "Tell him I loved him, even when I didn't show it." "I'll tell him," Giancarlo said. Then he raised his pistol, aimed it at the back of Anthony's head and pulled the trigger. The sound cracked across the empty pier, echoed off the water, and faded into the general noise of the city that never stopped, that absorbed all violence and continued grinding forward. Anthony's body dropped to the old wood, still and silent, and the soldiers who'd brought him there picked him up, carried him to the edge, and pushed him over the rail into the dark water below. He hit the surface and sank immediately, weighed down by the chains they'd wrapped around his ankles, disappearing into the Atlantic like he'd never existed at all. Just another ghost. Just another son who'd believed in something enough to die for it, and had learned too late that belief wasn't armor, that the only thing that protected you in this world was the wisdom to know when to bend. And Anthony Coletti, for all his courage and all his convictio,